Chapter 9. All About the Poor Brakeman. Mr. Potter was very miserable indeed on the edge of his chair, and twirling his hat dreadfully, and for the first moment after the handsome old gentleman spoke to him he had nothing to say. Old Mr. King was asking him for the third time, "You found out all about poor Jim's family, eh?" At last he emerged from his fit of embarrassment enough to reply, "Yes, sir." "Now that is very good!" the old gentleman cried approvingly, and wiped his face vigorously after his effort. "Very good indeed, Mr. Potter." Hiram Potter now followed up his first attempt to find his voice, and trying to forget the handsome surroundings that had so abashed him, he went on now quite glibly. "You see there's 6 of 'em, Jim's children." "Dear me!" ejaculated old Mr. King. "Yes, sir, there are." Mr. Potter's hat began to twirl uneasily again. "And the wife, she ain't strong, just got up from rheumatic fever." "That's bad, very bad," said Mr. King. "Those 3 boys of his are good," said Mr. Potter, brightening up a bit in the general gloom, "and the biggest one says he's going to be a brakeman just like his father. But the mother wants 'em all to go to school. You see that's what Jim was working for." "And the girl who wanted to play on the piano," broke in Polly eagerly. Then she blushed rosy red. "Oh, forgive me, Grandpa, for interrupting," and she hid her face on old Mr. King's arm. "I was just going to ask about that girl myself," said Grandpapa promptly. "Tell us about her, Mr. Potter, if you please." Hiram Potter set his hat carefully on the floor beside his chair. It was his Sunday hat, and evidently that, with his best clothes, which he had donned in honor of the occasion, were objects of great care. He scratched his head and thought deeply. "Well, now, you see, sir," he said slowly, "that's almost a hopeless cause, and I wish, as sure as I sit here, that girl had never thought of piano music. But it's born in her, the mother said. The girl's grandfather was a musician in the old home in Germany, and so she can't help it. Why, she's so crazy about it, she'll drum all up and down the kitchen table to make believe that—" "Oh, Grandpapa!" cried Polly in the greatest excitement, and hopping up and down by his side, "that's just as I used to do in the little brown house, the very same way, Grandpapa, you know." "Yes, she did, Father," cried Jasper, bobbing his head scarcely less excited, just as if old Mr. King hadn't heard the story many times. Mr. Potter, for want of something to do to express his amazement, picked up his hat, stroked it, and set it down again, staring with all his might. "So you did, Polly, so you did, my child," cried Grandpapa, taking her hands in both of his, and looking down into her shining eyes. "Well, well, to be sure. Now, Jasper, get the tablet, and write down the address of Jim's family as quickly as you can, my boy." So Jasper ran over to the library table, and brought back the tablet and pencil hanging to it, and pretty soon Jim's home was all described thus: Mrs. James Corcoran, 5 Willow Court, 3rd house from Haven Street. "It's kinder hard to find," observed Mr. Potter slowly, "because Willow Court runs into Haven Street criss-cross, and this number isn't on the house. It's got rubbed off. But if you follow up number 3 and come carefully, why, there you'll be where number 5 was." "Oh dear me!" said Mr. King. "Well, you may describe the house, for I am going down there tomorrow, and I certainly do not wish to waste my time by walking about." Polly and Jasper looked so very decidedly, "Oh, may we go too?" that the old gentleman added quickly, "and my young people will accompany me," which really left nothing more to be desired at present. "Well, it's a yeller house," said Mr. Potter, thinking very hard. "That is, it is in spots where the paint is on, and it's low and runs down to the back, and sets sideways. But I'll tell you how you'll know it. She's got, Mrs. Jim Corcoran has, the greatest lot of flowers in her window. They're chock full, sir." "I shall know it then," cried Polly, in great satisfaction. "I think there's no danger, sir, but what we will find the place all right." Old Mr. King was fumbling in his pocket in great perplexity. It never would do, he decided, pulling his hand out. No, I must contrive to send him something. Well now, Mr. Potter," he said aloud, "and where did you live? Quite near, I presume?" "Oh, just the other end of town, sir," said Mr. Potter. "I live on Acorn Street." "Acorn Street," repeated Mr. King, wrinkling his brows. "And where may that be, pray tell?" "It's over at the south end, sir. It runs off from Baker Street and Highland Square." "Oh, yes, yes," said the old gentleman, without much more idea than before. "I know where it is, father," said Jasper. "Dear me, you've had to take a good bit of time to get all this information, Mr. Potter." Mr. Potter looked down busily on the carpet, trying not to think how tired his feet were, saving some car fare for their owner. "Well, now, what number?" The old gentleman seeming to desire his whole address, that was soon given too. 23 Acorn Street, South End. "And I suppose you have a family?" went on the old gentleman, determined to find out all there was to it, now he had commenced. The little clerk began to hem and haw behind his hand. "No, sir, I haven't. That is, yes, I have, considerable. I mean, my 4 sisters. We all live together." "Oh, replied Mr. King. "Well, now, thank you very much, Mr. Potter. And as your time is valuable, and should be paid for," he tucked a bill within the nervous hands. "Oh, I couldn't take it, sir," cried Hiram Potter, greatly distressed. "But it's your due. Why, man, I shouldn't have asked you to take all this trouble, and spend so much time after I found you had to go so far." Mr. King was really becoming irate now, so that the little clerk didn't dare to say more. Bless me! Say no more, say no more. The little clerk was too much frightened to think of another word, and finding that the interview was considered closed, he picked up his hat, and in some way, he could never remember how, he soon found himself out of the handsome house, and skipping off nimbly in the fresh air, which quite revived him. "I could offer him only a trifle," old Mr. King was saying, "only what might repay him for his trouble and time tonight. But I shall speak to Fraser about him tomorrow, Jasper. That agent of mine is, curiously enough, in want of a clerk just at this time, and I know this little man can fit in very well, and it will get him away from that beastly office. 4 sisters! Oh my goodness! Well, Fraser must give him enough to take care of them." "Oh, how fine, father!" exclaimed Jasper, with kindling eyes. "And then the girl that wants to learn to play on the piano." "Oh dear me, yes!" Old Mr. King burst into a merry laugh. "I must look after that girl, or Polly won't speak to me, I am afraid. Will you, Polly, my child?" He drew her close to him and kissed her blooming cheek. "I am so very glad you are going to look out for her, Grandpapa," she cried, "because you know I did feel so dreadfully when I used to drum on the table in the little brown house," she confessed. I know, child." Grandpapa's face fell badly, and he held her very close. It always broke him up to hear the Peppers tell of the hard times in the little brown house, and Polly hastened to add brightly, "And then you came, Grandpapa dear, and you made it all just beautiful. Oh Grandpapa!" and she clung to him, unable to say more. "Yes, yes, so I did, cried the old gentleman delightedly, quite happy again, and stroking the brown hair. "Well, Polly, my girl, it isn't anything to the good times we are always going to have. And tomorrow you and I must go down to see after poor Jim's family." "And Jasper," cried Polly, poking up her head from old Mr. King's protecting arm. "He must go too, Grandpapa." "And Jasper? Why, we couldn't do anything without him, Polly," said the old gentleman, in such a tone that Jasper threw back his head very proudly. "Of course my boy must go too." And the next day Pickering Dodge, who thought he had some sort of a claim on Jasper for the afternoon, came running up the steps 2 at a time. And he looked so horribly disappointed that old Mr. King said, "Why don't you take him, Jasper, along with us?" Jasper, who would have much preferred to go alone with his father and Polly, swallowed his vexation and said, "All right." And when he saw Pickering's delight, he brightened up, and was glad it had all happened in just that way after all. "Now see here," said old Mr. King suddenly. They were turning out of Willow Court after their visit, and Thomas had a sorry time of it, managing his horses successfully about the old tin cans and rubbish, to say nothing of the children who were congregated in the narrow, ill-smelling court. "Why don't you boys do something for those lads in there?" pointing backward to the little run-down at the heel house they had just left. "We boys?" cried Pickering faintly. "Oh dear me, Mr. King, we can't do anything." "Can't is a bad word to use," said the old gentleman gravely, "that you all alone should do the work. But get the other boys interested. I am sure you can do that. Phew! Where are the health authorities, I should like to know, to let such abominations exist? Thomas, drive as fast as you can, and get us out of this hole." And he buried his aristocratic old face in his handkerchief. Pickering looked over at Jasper in great dismay. "We might have our club take it up," said Jasper slowly, with a glance at Polly for help. "Yes, why don't you, Jasper?" she cried. "Now that's what I'm going to propose that our Club of Salisbury girls shall do. We're just finishing up the work for a poor Southern family." "You've had a bee, haven't you?" asked Pickering, "or something of that sort. Although I don't really suppose you do much work," he said nonchalantly, "only laugh and play and giggle generally." "Indeed we don't, Pickering Dodge!" cried Polly indignantly. "Laugh and play and giggle, the very idea!" "And if you say such dreadful things, I'll pitch you out of the carriage," cried Jasper in pretended wrath. "Ow! I'll be good. Take off your nippers," cried Pickering, cringing back down into his corner as far as he could. "Goodness me, Jasper, you're a perfect old tiger." "Take care and keep your tongue in its place, then," said Jasper, bursting into a laugh. "And we work, oh, just dreadfully," declared Polly with her most positive air. "We cut out all the clothes ourselves. We don't want our mothers to do it, and sew, oh dear me!" "You ought to see our house on a club day when Polly has the bee," said Jasper. "I rather think you'd say there was something going on for these poor little Southern darkies." "Well, I don't see how you can work so for a lot of disgusting pickaninnies," said Pickering, stretching his long figure lazily. "The whole bunch of them isn't worth one good solid afternoon of play." Polly turned a cold shoulder to him, and began to talk with Jasper most busily about the club of boys. "Yes, and oh, Jasper, let's have one meeting of all you boys with us girls, the two clubs together," she cried at last, waxing quite enthusiastic. "Yes, let us," cried Jasper, quite as enthusiastic. "And oh, Polly, I've thought of something. Let's have a little play. You write it." "Oh, Jasper, I can't," cried Polly, wrinkling her brows. "Yes, Polly, you can," cried Jasper. "If it's one half as good as the Three Dragons and the Princess Clotilde, it will be just fine." "Well," said Polly, "I'll try, and what then, Jasper?" "Why, we'll give it for money. Father, may we, in the drawing room? And perhaps we'll make quite a heap to help those boys with. Oh, Polly!" He seized both of her hands and wrung them tightly. "Oh, may we, Father, may we?" "Eh, what's that? Oh, yes." The old gentleman took down his handkerchief. "Dear me, what a mercy we are where we can breathe," as Thomas whirled them dexterously past a small square. "What are the health authorities about to allow such atrocious old holes? Oh, yes, my boy, I'm sure I'd be delighted to have you help along those three lads. And it's really work for boys. Polly's going to start up something for the girl." "How perfectly fine!" exclaimed Jasper and Polly together, now that the consent was really gained. Then they fell into such merry chatter that Pickering, left out in the cold, began to wriggle dreadfully. At last he broke out, "Yes, I think it would be fine too," trying to work his head into the conference, where Polly and Jasper had theirs together buzzing over the plans. But nobody paid him the slightest attention, so he repeated his remark, with no better success. "I should think you might turn around," at last he said in a dudgeon, "and speak to a body once in a while." "Why should we?" cried Jasper over his shoulder. "You don't think it's worth while to work for any of those people. No, Polly, we'll let him severely alone." Then he fell to talking again, busier than ever. "Yes, I do," cried Pickering in a high, wrathful key. "Think it's worth while too, so there, Jasper King." "Oh, he does, I do believe, Jasper," cried Polly, looking at Pickering's face. "Why, of course I do," said Pickering. "And so we must let him into the plans." So Polly turned around to draw Pickering in, and Mr. King leaned forward in his seat, and the committee of Ways and Means got so very busy that he didn't even know when Thomas turned in at the big stone gateway, until Polly looked up and screamed out, "Why, we are home! Why, we can't be!" "Well, we are, Polly, my child," said old Mr. King, getting out to help her with his courtliest air. "We've been gone just 3 hours and a half, and a very good afternoon's work it is too. For Jim's children will care twice as much for what you young folks are going to do for them as for anything I may do. Yes, Polly, they will," as he saw her face. "And I'm sure if I were in their places I'd feel just the same way." CHAPter 9